Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming today. So this is going to be a webinar on historical markers in the grants program. I'm going to start things off before I toss it over to Todd to talk a little bit more about grants. But my name is Liz Koele. I'm the historical marker project lead currently at MNHS. And I started back in August, so I'm just about a year now at MNHS. So to start off, some background for the project that I'm currently working on. MNHS has a marker program. We have several hundred markers around the state out of the thousands that are out there. But the marker program's been on pause for the last 20 years and little work's been done during this time. I was brought on to pick things up again. So we really started off with the knowledge that we had markers out there, but that was kind of about all we knew at this point. So we had some questions at the beginning, like how many markers are out there? Where are they? What do they say? And what condition are they in? For the first part of the project, I did a lot of research. I looked through some internal files we have here at MNHS. I looked at some published books like the one here that is pictured by MNHS Press that has historical markers, not just MNHS's, but historical markers across Minnesota. And I also did some online research to kind of figure out a list of markers that I would try to visit. Along with researching markers to visit, I also did some research into the history of the program, and it's quite a long history. So MNHS's involvement in erecting historical markers started in 1930, right around the birth of the trunk highway system, and when investment really picked up in state highways and there was growing automobile traffic. So in 1930, MNHS partnered with the Department of Highways, which is the predecessor to MnDOT. And through this partnership, they oversaw putting up markers for the first couple kind of decades. And they were also aided in part eventually by some New Deal groups for out-of-work Minnesotans during the Great Depression. So groups like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, and the National Youth Administration helped create some markers at the beginning of the program, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. These markers have a really distinct style and they're pretty elaborate. They're really cool to look at. But these groups also help do general road improvements and build highway pull-offs and rest areas. So this work was kind of all grouped into that at the beginning of the program. But despite kind of all this work being done, things were pretty disorganized until the 1940s, when the program gained its first governing body, which was the Minnesota Historic Sites and Markers Commission. It was established by state statute, and it included representatives from MNHS, state parks, and the Department of Highways. And this group kind of managed things until the mid-1960s when MNHS took over the program. And MNHS established their own kind of governing body, the Historic Markers Committee, in the late 80s, which this second kind of group included staff and outside historians and also MnDOT representatives. But both of these groups, both the earlier commission and the later committee, they reviewed marker suggestions and requests. They picked spots to put up markers. They drafted marker texts. They reviewed what was existing and did a lot of the work like that. However, in the early 2000s, the program was put on pause due to a lack of funding. And that brings us to today when I'm doing my surveying work now. I hinted at it a little bit when I was talking about the New Deal work, but you can also see the history of the marker program through the different types of markers that have been erected throughout the years. So starting on the left, the very first type of marker that was erected was a steel plate design that you can see here. It was typically painted white with black lettering and a black frame. There's just a small handful of these still out there, which is kind of remarkable considering how old they are and in some of the weird kind of spots they still are. But eventually, once more of the labor was available with the New Deal, they started building these more elaborate permanent structures that you can see besides the steel plate design. So from the 30s to the 50s, they were putting up these stone kind of structures that had really elaborate kind of walls and sometimes seating areas built in. And in the middle of it all, there was a metal plaque that was the marker. But over the years, as they lost kind of the New Deal work um, and had less funds to work with, throughout the 50s and the 70s, these permanent structures became a lot less elaborate. They shrunk in size quite a bit. And the metal that made up the plate changed from kind of a copper alloy to more of an aluminum plaque, probably because it's cheaper to manufacture. But then this also kind of bleeds into the last phase of the markers and what we're currently using, which I have been calling the Siwa Studios design, which is just a plaque erected typically on a singular post. And Siwa Studios is a company out of Ohio that specializes in historical markers. And they make a lot of historical markers for other state marker programs. So there's lots of different examples of the work they kind of do out there. And this is what we're basically still using today. So a little bit about the surveying that I've been doing. So for the last couple months, I've been visiting all of the markers affiliated with MNHS using the research that I did at the beginning. For now, the final total of markers that we're saying are kind of included in this project is 206. And you can see at the map on the map at the right here where they all are. However, throughout the course of the project, I didn't get to them all. I only visited about 181. The ones that I visited are pictured in orange, and those in blue either are missing or they might still be up, but I had issues accessing them. There's only a small amount of that, but there's a fair kind of handful that are missing. Um, but when I did visit markers, the kind of data that I was collecting was location data or GPS coordinates, so we can go and find these markers again. Their physical condition or what issues they might currently have and might need to be addressed in the future. I also took extensive photographs when I was visiting for documentation purposes, but it also allowed me to later transcribe the markers, and we could also evaluate the markers' contents. So overall, throughout all these survey visits, I traveled a little over 7,500 miles these last few months, all throughout Minnesota. I'm currently working on a final report to compile and summarize the data that I've collected through my surveying, which will eventually be complete and probably shared with the public. But right now I thought I could just share some general highlights of what I found. So as far as when the markers were erected, the top 3 decades are the 90s, the 60s, and the 80s. And just about 65% of markers were put up in one of these 3 decades. In fact, over 30% of markers were put up in just the 90s, so a lot more recently than you might think. As far as where the markers are, most of the markers are located in parks, whether local, county, or state, or at rest areas or waysides. And as far as the difference between rest areas and waysides, rest areas I generally considered as having restrooms and other facilities and being along major highways or interstates. And waysides typically have a lot less. They might just be parking or a pull off alongside of the road. But 70% of the markers that were surveyed were at one of these 3 general locations. And then finally, as far as what the markers cover, what their topics are, the spread of markers was fairly diverse, and some markers actually were assigned more than one topic. But the top 3, which makes up about 40% of markers, are generally about business and industry, environment, or war and conflict. So business and industry might be a marker such as one titled Lumbering in Minnesota, talking about lumbering, obviously. And then environment might be something that is related to a historical landmark or a landscape or conservation. An example of this might be a marker on Lake Pepin. And then war and conflict might be a marker like there's one on historic Fort Ripley. So that's a brief overview of some of the surveying data. I'm going to go into a little bit broader kind of discussion about marker goals. So this is something at MNHS that we're still kind of thinking about and evaluating as we look towards the future of the marker program. But if you're looking to put up your own historical markers, some things that you might want to think about before you start that process are who your audience is going to be, who's going to visit your markers, or who do you want to visit your markers. You might also want to consider the takeaway that your visitors will be taking away from your markers. So what do you hope they will hopefully walk away thinking about? What do you want to convey to them? What's the purpose of your marker? And how are you going to measure the success of what you want people to take away? And then lastly, another thing you might want to think about is location. So how does the location where your marker is going to be at connect with the story you'll be telling? And this also connects to the previous 2 points, such as how will visitors get to your marker? How does this affect who's visiting? Do you have a location and need to pick a story, or is it the other way around where you have a story and need to pick a location? And what kind of stories can you tell if you have a location? And additionally, like what kind of space do you have to put up a marker? Do you only have space for one marker, or do you have space for kind of a larger interpretive project? So those are some goals you're really going to want to set, or things that you're going to want to decide before you get further into a project. But I'm also going to talk about what makes a good historical marker. And you'll notice I have good in quotation marks because it's a really subjective thing. And there's a lot to think about. You might also want to kind of ask what makes an effective historical marker, or in a marker that's going to achieve some of the goals that you set, like we talked about in the previous slide. So there's a lot of different ways that you can go about this and a lot of things to consider, but I broke it into considering contents and then materials. So what makes a good marker as far as contents? First, you're going to want to decide kind of what sorts of stories you want to tell. So a more complex story might need more than one marker to be effective, and that's going to affect your project, of course. Marker text is also another thing to generally think of as you keep moving forward in your project, especially because a lot of the times you want to consider a marker text really similar to exhibit text, because markers can act as an outside exhibit in some cases. So keep in mind kind of exhibit standards for length and readability. No one wants to stand outside forever to read a really long marker, and you want to make sure that as many people as possible can understand what you write. You're also going to want to think about if you're going to, or maybe not going to, incorporate images, maps, or quotes in your project, which will in turn affect the form that your marker takes. So there's some kind of good examples that I've included on this slide here. If you see at the top, this is a picture of one of the seawall markers that's at the Cox House in St. Peter. And you can tell that you have a limited space for content on these types of markers. And you're also limited by what kinds of images you could probably put on. I've never seen one of these markers with more than one. I'm not quite sure what CEWA would be able to do, but even when you have a photo or an image on these markers, you're limited with colors and kind of design as well. But if you have something that needs kind of more visuals to communicate your story or your point, you might want to consider some interpretive signage closer to the one pictured below, which is at Split Rock, which gives you more options as far as if you really need to focus on visuals or images. So working alongside that, you also need to think about materials when you think about what you want your marker to be. And the biggest thing to think about as far as materials is how long you want your marker to last. So how much time and energy and money will you be able to put into maintaining it? Not every marker is going to last forever. And this is also going to have an impact on what sort of marker you choose then. As I kind of already talked about, you also will want to consider location and space. So how much room do you have for your marker? Are you going to do several markers? You might also want to consider, if you have your location picked out, how much sunlight, water, or vehicle traffic might be around that location, because some marker types are going to fare better against these than others. And then finally, back to contents. Does your story have multiple parts? Are you going to have multiple markers? Or do you want something that's more concise and easy to read with maybe only a brief map? Um, these are kinds of the material or type of markers you kind of have to think about. And it goes a long way to helping you achieve your goals. So kind of on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Todd, who's going to talk a little bit more about how the grants program can also help you with your markers.
Great. Thanks, Liz. That was terrific. I'm Todd Mahon. I'm the State History Services Manager with the Minnesota Historical Society, but I also have a role with our grant program in that I review historical interpretation projects. And for us, historical interpretation is essentially the presentation of a story, a historical narrative, and all the products and components that are part of that. And that could be, certainly we'll focus on markers, but that is things like exhibits, can be publications, though I don't actually review the publications, but or programs, walking tours, that type of thing. Generally speaking, and I'm going to just sort of do the big picture here first before we zoom completely in on markers. The process of interpretation has you can definitely start with an interpretive plan. If you are, and we have a webinar that's posted on our website that goes into much greater detail about what a interpretive plan is and how it how the grant program can work for it. So, but I'm going to just spend a minute or so on it. You do not, and to be clear, you do not have to do an interpretive plan first if you're going to work on a marker. But if you are from a history museum or history organization, it could be a good place to sort of start. That could help you understand if markers are a good choice for you and what types of history you want to be depicting on those markers. And so an interpretive plan is a plan that helps an organization sort of figure out what thematically they want to tell and provide some focus to the programs and implement and historical interpretation that they put out there for their audience. And it generally works with starts with an audience analysis of who the people are that are going to be engaging with the program, what are their wants and needs with it, and then it will focus in on the organization itself and look at what are sort of called the resources of the organization. Those resources are pretty broadly defined. It can certainly be things like the staff and the space that the museum offers and those types of things. But it can also talk about the objects in a collection that sort of are able to tell stories, or the stories that are known by the organization. And if you can sort of imagine the Venn diagram of circles laying over each other, it sort of says like, well, what does the audience want? What are you able to present? And then where do those things meet together? And then it sort of looks at those things and it helps then sort of find out what some themes are to provide some focus for the organization. And it will often then also make some general to specific recommendations about the best ways to present that interpretation, be it exhibits, be it historical markers or walking tours or whatever. So it's a great place to start, although it's not a place that you have to start if you're working on a marker. But I always want to throw in a pitch for interpretive plan, so I thought I'd put that in there. And then what you can see in this diagram here is these are the things that you can do, that the grant program can help with, to sort of start with that planning all the way to what we call implementation. In this case, the fabrication and installation of a marker, or the publishing of the book, or the construction of the exhibit. And you'll see that red line there. And that red line there is to let you know that some of these things you can combine into one grant application and project, but some of them you can't. Implementation, so for a marker, the fabrication and installation of it, that cannot be combined with a project to do research and writing or planning for it. And the reason for that is that when the legislature set up this grant program, it said that we had to apply existing standards to the work. And a standard for history work is to do peer review of what you're going to present. And so for an application to fabricate and install a marker, what we need with that application is the final draft of the text. as well as 2 letters of critical review from outside experts that have reviewed the content and provide some critical feedback on it that say like, here's where they could add more, here's where they do well, those types of things. And so that's what happens with those letters of critical review. So we require those things with the application. It's not something we can condition during the process. But as you can see from the slide, we can fund those things ahead of it too. Those just have to be separate grants, and they would have to be closed out and with final reports received before you can apply for the next steps. Those steps that are on the right side of it, the planning, the research, and the writing, you can combine those, or you can, as to your capacity and sort of own timeline, you can divide them as well. I'm just going to talk a little bit about research and content development. And so, Liz, I wonder if you can just advance the slide for me. Okay, so research and writing, and I'm going to focus more of my comments on the implementation, but research and writing might be of interest to some of you as well. So research and writing are things that can be funded by the grant program too. Any grant-funded project produces a product, and so with a research project, it produces a research report. So that's going to be a requirement of the project. When you come in with an application to produce research, what we're looking for in there is a research plan. And a research plan is just a way to sort of set up guardrails on your own research and sort of define what it is that you want to accomplish, what it is that you're looking to learn. And so the research plan is typically going to sort of pose questions of what is it that you're looking to learn? And then within that, it can sort of answer some of those questions within the research plan too. What do you already know about it? And then what do you not know about it? What are those known knowns and what are those known unknowns? And so that's a key part to the research plan, but it should also describe generally the places that you know that you're going to go to get this information. The County Historical Society, the Minnesota Historical Society. Maybe there's a collection of oral histories that you want to access. Now, these aren't things that you're locking yourself into that you can only do those things. It's a plan. It's not a blood oath contract to follow forever and ever. So if there are deviations from that, that's certainly acceptable, but the plan should sort of provide some of that direction with it. So that's what we're looking for in a research plan. And then what it will ultimately produce from a research project is the research report. And that's really just, well, what did you learn? Not much more complicated than that. And so we generally look for 3 things in a research report, 3 components to it. One is what was learned, and you can put that in sort of a narrative style, sort of, think back to a book report in school or something like that. And these things should sort of be answering back to what those original research questions were, or it could be a detailed outline or that type of thing. So, but basically just what did you learn? The second component is an annotated bibliography of all of the sources that you consulted. And so that's going to be, it's an annotated bibliography. So it's not just the basic information of author and title and publication date and things like that, but a 1 or 2 sentence description of what the content of it was and specifically how it relates to the project and research questions that you're asking for. And then the third component, which we don't require, but I really strongly encourage, is just a very brief treatment at the end, maybe 100 or a couple hundred words that says, what are some possible future uses of this research? Now, you can certainly sort of say, well, we were always doing a marker with it. That was the intention, and you can describe that. But maybe in that research, you have also discovered some video or some 16mm film, and you just sort of say, like, there's a documentary in here too, or something like that. Not something that you have to commit yourself to, but think of this research report as kind of a map for others that are coming along that want to research the same topic, or maybe a different sort of like variation on the topic. And so think of it as like a roadmap for them for what information that you learned and what could be useful from it. And then Liz kind of covered some of the writing pieces too. We generally look for a 6th to 8th grade reading level. It can be higher than that, but that's kind of like where most people say you should sort of start to, though I'll totally acknowledge it can be very difficult to get to a 6th to 8th grade reading level. And 6th to 8th grade isn't because our education system has failed us and that nobody can read above that grade level. It's really, as Liz said, it's kind of about the context that people come to these markers in, that they're standing in front of it. They're, it's sort of like horizontally and rather vertically in front of them, and so it's not the easiest thing to read. It's not like a book in your lap, in a comfortable chair by the under a lamp. It's so it's they're thinking about the physical comfort of somebody, but also just things that are written to that grade level. People have a better time both comprehending but also retaining it as well. So that's why we look for that. And we also want you to, when writing it, to consider perspectives, absent narratives. What stories aren't being represented here? What communities aren't being represented here? And so think about those things as well when in the research and writing phase. And so, oh, and one other important thing, if it's not obvious, like these markers that we will fund are specifically feature historical interpretation. They have to be telling a story about it and sort of put it into context. It can't just be a marker that says the Acme County courthouse built in 1932. There has to be interpretation to it. That's what we're funding, because the funds are there for Minnesota history. So Liz, if you could just advance the slide for me. Thank you. So the grant program, the application for it, which is found in our online portal called Flux, is it's the same questions. If you're putting a roof on your National Register building, you're constructing an exhibit, or you're doing these marker projects, or you're conserving objects in your collection, they all have the same questions. And so I'm just going to kind of go through what's a few of the what the question fields are in the application, and talk a little bit about if you're doing an implementation project to actually fabricate and build that marker, what types of answers you're going to want to have in there. So I'll just talk a little bit for the implementation, the requirements that we have, that required attachments, and some of these I've briefly touched on. But as I said before, that requirement is a final draft of the marker text. You also have to have 2 letters of critical review, as I mentioned. And so those letters of critical review, if you're from the Acme County Historical Society, it can't be letters of critical review from other staff or volunteers with the Acme County Historical Society. You should go out and find others that can understand the content and provide some feedback for it. If you need help with that, we can definitely be helpful with that. You have to, it's your responsibility to find them, but we can definitely be asked if we know other subject matter experts or local experts that we can connect you with, and we definitely have done that before. And then it's not a requirement, but competitive applications will also have a response to those letters of critical review. So it's not just well, the letters are there and that's that. Well, did you actually use them, or did you make use of the critical feedback that you got from there? And it doesn't mean that you have to take every recommendation from a letter of critical review. For example, if a letter of critical review says, that they say that the date is 1938, but it's actually 1940, well, there's a couple of ways you can respond to that. You might say, oh, yes, thank you for pointing that out, and on following up, that's the correct date, and we'll make that change. Or you could say, our research shows that it was in 1938, and here's the reason why. So you don't have to respond to everything, but you should be showing us that you were able to use that feedback, and if it did alter the final draft of the text. The other thing that's required with it is that the legacy logo or boilerplate credit statement is on the marker. All of these products have to attribute that the funds came from Minnesota taxpayers. And so you can see in the photographs here, here's a marker that was put up just about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago now, for the Washburn Water Tower in Minneapolis. And so this is a more graphic driven one, so they felt it was totally appropriate for them to put the logo on there, and then the statement that the project had been financed in part with funds provided by the state of Minnesota, et cetera, et cetera. So you can do, it's an and/or in this, you can include both of them or just one of them, but that is a requirement from the legislature. Liz, thank you. So we'll move on to the budget for these. Every application has to include a budget for it. And for implementation, very typical budget line items are some pre-production work. We don't see this all the time, but I see it sometimes. And this is kind of like if a graphic designer has to do some pre-production work to get the files ready to send to the fabricator. You definitely see this a lot more on more graphic driven ones, but so that's an eligible cost. Obviously, the cost to produce and fabricate the marker, that's usually the big cost associated with these, and so that's a typical line item. Another typical line item is the site preparation access. Liz talked about how access is important to these, so it might need a cement pad to it, and maybe a short pathway that allows people access to the marker so that they can read it and they can engage with it. And then, of course, the installation. I mean, just the cost of mounting it and putting it into the ground. So that's there for people to see. On the there was something else I was going to say, but I lost it. Maybe I'll remember it later. And so anyway, Liz, we can go on to the next slide. The kind of the real big question field with the web app, with the application, is the project description. And this is really where you're going to sort of like tell us kind of the big picture of it. What is this marker for? What is it going to say? Why is it going in this spot? And those types of things. And so you'll want to talk about what research the information is based on. If you've used the grant program to fund research and you've got a research report that was produced, you should be attaching that. You might have done the research and writing on your own. That happens a lot with markers. And so, but you still should be able to tell us what research it was based on. If it's from a couple of publications, you can describe those, but do tell us how the information was interpreted and where it came from. We also want to know who was engaged with in the creation of the text, staff, those types of things, who wrote it. If it's interpretation about a particular community, you should be talking about if that community had a role in if they were consulted with it. If it's about the disabled community or something like that. And the disabled community has a terrific phrase or saying about nothing about us without us. You should be talking to those communities about the way that the history is being depicted there. And if you have done that, you should be describing that in the project description. Tell us, obviously, where's this marker going to go? Is it going to be an accessible spot to the public? I mean, as Liz said, many of the MNHS markers are in parks and rest stops and waysides. Those obviously have great accessibility. But maybe it's on the side of a building that's publicly accessible, those types of things. So we just want to know, is it accessible to the public? And that should include ADA accessibility as well. Are as many people going to be able to physically access this as are possible? What about, are there arrangements with the property owner? It might be, it's a real common thing to see the local historical society putting a marker up on city or county property in a park or something like that. Do you actually have permission to put that there? If it's going to go on to the side of a building, do you have the permission of the building owner to do that? So those arrangements should be made by the time of the application, and you should be able to demonstrate that those arrangements have been made in your application. Another thing that we ask for is if you just tell us if it's at a National Register of Historic Places site. That's that NRHP. I shouldn't have assumed. I assume many of you know what that stands for, but I probably should have spelled that out. And the reason for that is it's great to have these at National Register sites. I mean, they're perfectly suitable and wonderful places to interpret history. But if it's on a National Register site, we might need to refer the application to our colleagues at the State Historic Preservation Office to see if the marker itself is going to be impacting negatively the historical integrity of it, if it's being mounted on the side of the building or something like that. And I mean, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I mean, if it's a 50-foot billboard-sized marker that sort of is going to obscure people's vision of the building, then that's something that we would want to know about too, and would help our funding decision. So Liz, if you could move to the next slide. One of the other final questions that are in the application is the question of enduring value. And I always sort of describe this as, this question is like, how will Minnesotans in the future benefit from this project? And so you might sort of say, well, it's a marker and we intend for it to be up for decades and decades and, maybe forever, whatever that means. And it's not so much that we're sort of asking, we do ask certainly about the materials and how long it's going to last for, but things happen to the markers. As Liz identified with her project, there's a dozen or 2 dozen that we don't know what happened to them. I sometimes say that these things grow legs. For a highway project or a road gets widened, sometimes these things get moved and put into storage and they're intended to be put back and they're kind of forgotten about, those types of things. But sometimes these things disappear. And so how are Minnesotans in the future going to benefit from this? And frankly, there's a real simple fix for this, and we do it for a lot of our interpretation projects. Is just indicate in your application that you are placing a copy of the final draft of the text and those associated records, the research, the letters of critical review, that they're in an accessible repository. If you are the County Historical Society and you're the applicant, you can say that those will be available in your archives. If you're, or you can, if you're not, don't have your own museum or archives, you can maybe work with the local county or local historical organization to place it in their archives and work with that. But those things should be worked out at the application. We have very often made that a condition, so we funded it, but even though it wasn't indicated in the application, and just have asked for them to make some arrangements for that. Liz, we can go into the next slide. And then the last, well, one of the last questions, and the last one I'm going to be covering is the question of sustainability, and that's really sort of like what's the kind of like long-term management of the project after, in this case, the marker is put in the ground. Like, what are the ways that we can sort of ensure that there will be continued access and care for it? Excuse me. And so this is one of those things where you know, Liz talked on it a little bit, but what are the physical materials that the marker is going to be made from? Tell us about how these materials are going to hold up to the environment. Some of those sort of non-metal ones that feature more graphics and images, they can be a little bit more susceptible to fading in the sun and ultraviolet light. And so what are the, you know, tell us about the materials and how it's sort of designed to hold up against that. We don't really see these very often. I don't know if I've ever seen one, but, you know, if you're producing a painted wooden marker, well, that's, you know, probably not that sustainable. And frankly, there's funds in the grant program that we might say that it's a better choice to do this out of metal, so that there's just stands up to the weather a little bit more. This is kind of a big one too, but who's responsible for the repair and maintenance and replacement? As I described in a slide or two back, it's a pretty common thing where the marker is installed by one organization, but it's on the property of another. And so what happens when, like you see in the image here, it gets hit by a snowplow? Or I don't know if this is frankly vandalism or what. We came upon it after the incident happened, but is there an agreement about how to take care of those things? And it doesn't have to be that it's the applicant or the property manager, but if the property owner, but if those two have come to an agreement, those things should be described, and it really helps in the application for us to understand and makes it more competitive if those things have been figured out with the application. And then last, and this is very important, do you have a process for how you're going to handle newly revealed information or perspectives, and essentially how do you handle possible edits and corrections to the marker? You know, history, we're always learning new things, new facts are being revealed. And so if there is new information to share, does that necessarily mean, or if there's a correction to be made, you found out that there is a wrong date or something like that, does that mean that you have to immediately change it? Possibly, yes. It depends on, I suppose, how egregious the error or the factual mistake is. But in some ways, it's just sort of like, do you have a process for taking that information in if somebody does point out that you know, like, this should be changed, or this information is incorrect? And the great time to sort of like reevaluate if you want to change the interpretation is if an incident like we see in the image here is if it gets knocked down and you're going to replace it. Now in this case, the marker is probably itself fine, but if you're replacing the metal marker, why replace it in kind? Now's the time to consider, is this still the way you want to tell the story? Is the information in there still factually correct? And so just develop a process for that and explain that in that sustainability section. So that's maybe a too brief explanation about how the marker program, how the grant program can work for markers that you all might be applying for. But and I didn't put this in the slides, and neither of us did, but we could put our contact information, and we can definitely share that. Feel free to get a hold of me if you have questions about how the marker program can, how the grant program can fund your own markers. I'm Todd Mahon. You can just get a hold of me at todd.mahon@mnhs.org, TODD.MAHON at MNHS.org. And then, so we definitely have some time for questions.
Hey, Todd, can we apply for more than one marker?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yes, you can. And I mean, one thing that we didn't really talk in much detail about the grant program itself. there's two different funding levels during the year. There are 4 times a year we offer, we accept applications that are for $10,000 and less. And then once a year, we accept applications that are for more than $10,000. And there's the dates and all that are on the website. Generally, it's, well, specifically the small ones are the second Fridays of January, April, July, and October. And then the larger one sort of shifts around a little bit depending on what year we are in the biennium. In the first year of the legislative biennium, it's the pre-application is in early July, and a final application is in September-ish. And then this year, which is the second year of the biennium, the pre-applications deadline was in May, and the final application was just this past Friday. So we're getting ready to review the final applications for the large round. So I'm sorry, that's more detail than you want on that. But yes, you can apply for multiple ones. You should, in some ways, it's up to you to sort of explain and defend, I guess, for a lack of a better term, why these things are being applied for together. If it is a series that are sort of connected, maybe that makes sense. Or if you're doing kind of a walking trail or something like that, that might make sense too.
Where do most of the at what funding level do most of the signs end up at?
Well, you're going to be frustrated with this, but it depends. But it depends a little bit. But for a single sign, like what it depends on is if you're doing like the sort of what Liz referred to as the Siwa style signs. I call them the lollipop signs, the sort of the metal single post. Those will, a single marker generally are in the $4,000 to $6,000 range.
Okay.
That said, it's also like they're really sort of like subject to sort of like world economic conditions about the price of metal, and so they definitely go up and down.
And then one final question: what kind of common mistakes do you see in the applications?
I think these aren't so much mistakes. These are definitely not mistakes like in their sort of like processor in the marker, but I very often see somebody applying, wanting to combine implementation with the research and writing, and we just have to send that back. And so the comments back are helpful, or we intend them to be helpful to sort of like so that they can come back again for a successful application. But that's the most common thing that I see, or that they didn't have letters of critical review or something like that.
I lied. I had one more question.
Well, now I'll never trust you, Tom, but like, go ahead.
My last question was, how do we get the materials and how do we start the process?
Like the application materials?
Yes.
The John Fulton, maybe you can help me with the, is it MNHS.org/grants, or am I missing something in there? But go to the website, and that will have some instructions. The one of the first things you'll want to do, and there'll be instructions there, is to, if you haven't already, set up an account in our web portal Flux, and that account, and then that'll give you the sort of access to apply. And you don't even have, even if you're thinking about maybe down the line we'll be applying for something or we're not ready to apply for it yet, there's no reason not to sort of set up the account now, because then you just will be that much more ready if if there's a delay in your other sort of planning. So you definitely don't want to be setting up your account on the day that the application is due. It's not an automated thing. It's people that are actually doing it. So there's we have to actually, not me, but one of our grants admin staff has to sort of convert the account over.
So
the
is
application.
so is the process included in the drop-down menu for the grant portal?
Yeah, not so much in the grant portal, but on the web page. And it looks like John Fulton just put a link in.
Oh, thank you, John.
Yeah, so if you go to that link, and then you'll see a sidebar on the left-hand side, and that will have some instructions. And there's also, I always definitely encourage people to send an email to our grants inbox, which is just grants@mnhs.org, and that's sort of can be triaged off to the right staff person, because I'm a content reviewer on these, and if you haven't figured out, I'm not the greatest person to sort of like talk to you about the very specifics of the app, the web portal, and getting your account set up. But we have grants admin staff, and they can be helpful with that. So if you just send something to grants@mnhs.org, we'll get it to the right person to help you with your question. And I do really believe, like, we really firmly believe in customer service, and And so we get back to you as soon as we can.
Thank you.
So is anybody thinking about a marker? Oh, Megan, you've got a question. Go ahead.
I have a question for Liz. I'd like to hear about your favorite marker that you found.
Oh boy. That's kind of a hard one. I don't know if I can pick a specific one, but I did really like, I don't know if you were able to tell with the amount of detail I went to, but I think it ended up maybe being like 15 or 20 markers, but the markers that were made by the New Deal kind of work groups are really cool because they're so big and elaborate. They've got huge walls and kind of details going on, and they're really interesting. They're also spread pretty much all over the state, so you can find them almost anywhere, but there's only, like I said, a few of them.
Any other questions? Anybody have a project in mind that I'm happy to think about that out loud with anybody too, and in front of others? So maybe. Emily, go ahead.
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself. Quick question, well, hopefully a quick question. So I work for Washington County Historical Society, and we have several different communities, and they all have different priorities and needs and everything. And I was wondering if you had any advice for balancing those needs. There's some communities that are maybe a little bit more gung-ho on signs than others.
Yeah.
And just, do you have any recommendations as to how to suit those needs effectively?
Well, I wasn't expecting that to go through. That's a good question though. I think it's definitely in some ways like it should be it should follow the priorities of what the county historical society sort of has, and so like, and where your sort of like resources are able to go, and which might be too simple of a sort of response, but I think that might sort of be helpful. And I think frankly also if there are those ones that don't meet what your priorities are, or where your sort of capacities to sort of go, is to definitely encourage them, like, well, they can work on their own markers, and if they're an eligible applicant, our grant program can work with them too. And so that's part of why Liz is talking about the MNHS marker program, and while there's a lot of them out there and they're covering the whole state, she also, as she stated, like, we have a fraction of what we know that's out there. We have like 207 that we know about, that we've laid eyes on in the last year, and then maybe 230 total out there, but there's thousands of them out there, and MNHS doesn't own the historical marker market, and I certainly don't believe we should either. Just like in Washington County, the county historic society doesn't have to be the organization that installs all of them either. So you could also point them in that direction too, if that's their priority, and that's great. I mean, I obviously love to hear that people want to put a marker up. Then maybe you can just point them to me, and I can help them figure out how that they can install it.
That helps. Thank you so much.
Well, I can only stand silence for so long. I'm that type of person. So I think we can say, like, we'll give it just another half minute or so. But if there's no other questions, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you, everybody, very much for joining us. And John put our email addresses in the chat. Feel free to get a hold of us if you have any follow-up questions. We're happy to do that. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.